There is a moment in every nation's story when it stops being ruled and starts being influenced. The rulers don't come on horses anymore, they come in suits with contracts and clauses. When we talk about globalization, we imagine airports, trade, technology, but globalization isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's a new constitution written not by our parliament but by the world. Let's go back to 1947. India was newly free. We were poor but proud. And when Ambedkar stood in the Constituent Assembly, he said, quote, political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of its social democracy. Unquote. In other words, real sovereignty comes from within, not from what's stamped on treaties. But by 1990s, something shifted. The Berlin Wall fell and India's economy opened its doors. We liberalized, we privatized, we globalized, and quietly, something else happened. Our decision making began to migrate. From Delhi to Washington, from Mumbai to Geneva, what was once our parliament's prerogative started sounding like a foreign policy briefing. Let's talk about the globalization bargain. Let me tell you a story. In 1991, when India faced a balance of payments crisis, our foreign reserves had dropped below what was needed for 2 weeks of imports. Gold was physically flown out of the country as a collateral. The IMF agreed to help, but with a list of structural reforms. And in that moment, a silent transaction happened. We exchanged part of our policy freedom for financial rescue. Nobody voted for it. We debate in parliament. No amendment to the constitution, just an agreement signed in Washington that changed the economic DNA of India forever. That's how globalization works. It doesn't knock the door, it enters through the window. The next is the law behind the curtain. But the real story isn't economic, it's legal. Our constitution says under Article 253, the parliament can make laws for implement treaties and international agreements. Sounds harmless, right? Unless you realize that one line gives parliament power to override state laws in the name of treaty obligation. So when India signs the TRIPS agreement under WTO, suddenly our patent law gets rewritten. When we ratify the Paris Agreement, our environmental obligations shift. When we join FATF and OECD tax protocols, our financial laws change overnight. These aren't bad things, but they happen outside the gaze of the ordinary citizen. We debate who gets tickets for election, but not who rewrites our trade policies. That's what I call the invisible constitution of globalization. It operates in English, economics, and executive notifications, rarely in public conscience. Next is the new kind of dependency. Remember the phrase license Raj? We ended it in 1991, but a new Raj replaced it, the compliance Raj. Globalization is full of checklists. If you want foreign investment, you must score high in ease of doing business. If you want good credit ratings, you must cut your fiscal deficit. If you want trade access, you must harmonize your labor laws. Sounds like global governance, but it's also global conditioning. We start obeying metrics instead of our people. We start fearing what Fitch or Moody's say more than what Parliament debates. And this is how sovereignty becomes psychological. Next is when law becomes a Trojan horse. Here's a chilling example. In 2011, an international arbitration tribunal penalized India for cancelling a telecom license. The investor argued India violated the bilateral investment treaty. India argued we were protecting public interest. The tribunal didn't care. It awarded damages worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So think about that. An unelected body sitting in The Hague overruled a sovereign parliament's decision made in Delhi. Now imagine. If a country cannot regulate its own natural resources, how free is that freedom? That's why I say globalization isn't an event, it's a negotiation that never ends. Next to discuss is everyday sovereignty. It's not all abstract. Let me bring it closer to life. When you open Instagram, your data flows through servers in California. When a farmer in Haryana checks global commodity price, those prices are set in Chicago. When Delhi bans plastic, someone in Brussels decides whether your exports are eco-compliant. That's the everyday erosion of sovereignty. Invisible, polite, algorithmic. Next to discuss is the Ambedkar reminder. Ambedkar once warned, democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. He was talking about our feudal mindset, but it applies equally to globalization. We have built skyscrapers of ambition on a foundation of dependence. We want to be sovereign, but we want the world's approval too, and that tension defines our era. The constitution gave us political independence. Globalization tests whether we can handle economic and technological independence. Because if we outsource thinking, we will eventually outsource sovereignty itself. So as we move forward, I want you to ask yourself this: can a nation truly be free when its economy, technology, and even its laws are entangled in invisible contracts? The constitution was meant to be the supreme law of India, but has the world already written a quiet amendment once we never ratified? Act 2 of this lecture is about the constitutional blueprint. How the framers saw the world. Let's rewind to 1946. The world had just survived 2 world wars and was trying to imagine peace through paperwork. The United Nations, Bretton Woods, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. India wasn't even independent yet, but its leaders were already thinking, how do we exist in this new world order? Because independence meant nothing if we were to walk straight from the British Empire into an American one. That's the seed of sovereignty the framers were obsessed with. They wanted India to cooperate with the world, but never obey it. Let's talk about Article 51, the idealist clause. Now look at Article 51, tucked quietly in the Directive Principles. It says the state shall endeavour to promote international peace and security and foster respect for international law. Sounds noble. But the keyword here is endeavour. Ambedkar deliberately made it non-binding. Why? Because he knew international law is a moving target, written mostly by powerful nations and followed mostly by weaker ones. When some members argued India should automatically adopt international law, Ambedkar replied sharply, no nation can be bound by a law to which it has not consented. In one line, he protected the spirit of sovereignty from global romanticism. That's constitutional foresight. Next, the Article 253, the power clause. Now on the other side of the spectrum lies Article 253, a sleeping giant. It gives Parliament power to make laws to implement international treaties, even on subjects that normally belongs to the states. At first glance, it looked like cooperation, but hidden inside it is a silent centralization, where a treaty signed by the Union Executive can suddenly reshape domestic law across the nation. This wasn't accidental. In the Constituent Assembly, K.T. Shah raised this very fear, that future governments might use treaties to override federal autonomy. Ambedkar responded that it was necessary in a globalized world. He said India cannot be isolated from the rest of the world, yet it must retain its right to interpret international obligations in its own way. And that's the paradox. Ambedkar foresaw globalization, but not its scale. He imagined treaties about peace and security, not trade, patents, digital data, or carbon markets. The law stayed the same, the world didn't. The sovereignty debate in the Constituent Assembly is the next part. Let's bring back Nehru. He once said, we live in a world of interdependence. Isolation is neither possible nor desirable. But for Sardar Patel, sovereignty was not non-negotiable. He warned that too much external dependence would make our freedom ornamental. The result? A constitution that tried to balance idealism and realism, moral leadership abroad, self-determination at home. But remember, the framers lived in a pre-digital, pre-WTO era. They couldn't have imagined a day when international law would regulate your data, your investments, your climate policy, your trade secrets. So their safeguards were philosophical, not procedural. They trusted Parliament to act wisely. But today, Parliament barely debates treaty obligations before the Cabinet signs them. That's how the cracks begin. Next to discuss is when global law meets Indian courts. Now let's enter the courtroom. In 1978, the Supreme Court in Jolly George Varghese versus Bank of Cochin refused to enforce an international covenant on debtors' imprisonment, saying International law cannot override domestic law unless Parliament says so. Classic sovereignty. But in 1997, in Visakhapatnam state of Rajasthan, the same court cited international conventions on women's rights, even though India hadn't passed a law on the subject to fill a legal vacuum. Classic globalization. So from 1978 to 1997, the judicial mood shifted from sovereign cause motion to global moralism. That shift wasn't legal, it was psychological. It reflected India's rising global confidence, but also its growing acceptance that moral legitimacy could be imported from Geneva. Next to discuss is the new form of consent. The constitution gives consent through parliament, but globalization gives consent through participation. When India joins an international regime, the assumption is that we have consented. But ask yourself, who really consented? Did parliament vote? Did the states debate? Did the people even know? In modern governance, consent has become administrative, non-democratic. There's a quiet constitutional revolution no one talks about. The citizens' will is replaced by bureaucratic assent, signed at 2 a.m. in global conference hall. And yet, when those obligations come home, they are enforced like any other law. That's how the chain of accountability gets thinner. From we the people to we the participants. Next to discuss is the story of shrimp and sovereignty. Here's a fascinating case. In the WTO dispute known as the shrimp turtle case, the United States banned imports of shrimp caught without turtle excluder devices. India argued that this was an unfair trade restriction. The WTO ruled partly against India, saying environmental protection was valid, but discrimination wasn't. So a foreign tribunal sitting halfway across the world decided how Indian fishermen couldn't fish in the Bay of Bengal. That's not just trade law, that's a story of jurisdictional reach. And it raises a profound constitutional question. If international law can define our fishermen work, our farmers grow, our companies invest, what remains exclusively ours? Now let's discuss the changing language of law. Once upon a time, sovereignty meant flags, borders, armies. Today, its clauses, patents, algorithms. The framers spoke in the language of territory. Globalization speaks in the language of networks. That's why our constitution feels like a moral compass trying to navigate a digital storm. Its text was meant for governments. Its reality now deals with corporations, NGOs, rating agencies, data brokers, none of whom are accountable to voters. And yet, the citizen still believes the constitution is the highest law. In practice, it's one of many competing systems, legal, digital, financial, environmental, that define modern sovereignty. Now let's discuss the coming constitutional crossroads. We are heading toward a new kind of constitutionalism, where sovereignty isn't lost overnight, it's outsourced bit by bit. You outsource your currency policy to IMF standards, your trade to WTO, your data to global tech firms, your climate goals to COP summits. And before you realize, your constitution becomes a participant in global governance, not its master. But here's the truth. The framers didn't write the constitution to compete in the world. They wrote it to preserve choice, the choice to adapt on our terms. That's what sovereignty truly means, not isolation, but autonomy in decision. So when you hear the word global commitment, ask, commitment to what and at what cost? Our forefathers built the constitution as a shield against domination. Globalization, if unchecked, can turn that shield into glass. Transparent, admired, but fragile. The next part of this lecture is about the modern battle, from courts to corporates to the citizen. 1991 was not just an economic reform, it was a constitutional inflection point. Because until then, India's sovereignty has been defined by self-reliance. The idea that our decisions, our industries, our economy were to be shaped by Indian priorities. But with the balance of payments crisis came a quiet surrender wrapped in pragmatism. Sold as reform, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO entered not as invaders but as saviors. And from that moment, our constitutional sovereignty entered a negotiation table, one that has never really closed. Let's discuss the Washington Consensus and the Indian Parliament. The Washington Consensus, a doctrine prescribing liberalization, privatization, and global integration was never debated in parliament. It wasn't passed as law, it was adopted as policy. And yet, its implications reshaped every constitutional promise. Directive principles were reinterpreted as economic aspirations, not social obligations. Labor protections were relaxed, trade barriers were dropped, public enterprises, symbols of Nehruvian sovereignty, were sold off. It's not that reform was wrong, it's that the locus of decision making shifted from Delhi to Washington, from cabinet notes to conditional loans. And when decisions that affect 1.3 billion people are written in the language of conditionalities, democracy becomes an afterthought. That's how sovereignty erodes, not through coups, but through compliance. Next to discuss is WTO, the treaty that became a constitution. In 1995, India joined the World Trade Organization, a global treaty regime that could actually strike down national laws if they violated trade rules. Let that sink in. No Indian court, no Indian legislature, no Indian executive could overrule a WTO panel's finding. When the WTO ruled against India's import restrictions on agricultural products in 1999, India quietly complied. When it ruled against India's solar energy policy in 2016, saying we couldn't prioritize domestic manufacturers, we again complied. So here's the paradox. Our constitution guarantees socialism in its preamble, but the WTO demands non-discrimination in trade. Our constitution guarantees environmental protection under Article 48A, but the WTO restricts trade barriers based on production methods. Which law governs India, then the constitution or the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures? This is the new frontier of constitutional law, where sovereignty isn't about armies, it's about clauses and compliance deadlines. Next to discuss is judicial dilemmas, global commitments versus domestic priorities. The Indian judiciary too is caught in this tension. In Gramophone Company of India versus Birender Bahadur Pandey 1984 case, the Supreme Court said, rules of international law are incorporated into national law only when they do not conflict with municipal law. But later, in cases like Vishaka and Apparel Sport Promotion Council versus Chopra, courts began invoking international norms as moral mandates. This judicial cosmopolitanism made the court more progressive, but also less sovereign, because moral authority started coming from outside the constitution. In Nafte Johar, Nalsa, and the Puttaswamy judgment, judges cited international human rights treaties to interpret Indian rights expensively, even without domestic ratification. It feels virtuous, but it also blurs the constitutional chain of accountability. No foreign treaty is answerable to the Indian voter. That's the paradox of a moral globalism inside a democratic framework. Next, to discuss is the rise of corporate sovereignty. Today, sovereignty doesn't just lie with nations, it lies with corporations. Apple can resist data access requests from governments. Google decides what the public sees. Facebook determines political discourse. Amazon shapes consumption patterns that rewrite local economies. When WhatsApp or Meta tweak a privacy policy, they are effectively legislating. Think about it. These platforms reach more Indians daily than the constitution itself. And yet, their allegiance is to shareholders, not citizens. When the Indian government demanded data localization, global tech firms resisted, invoking trade agreements and international standards. When India sought to regulate algorithms under the IT rules, foreign chambers called it a non-tariff barrier. That's how corporate sovereignty quietly rivals constitutional sovereignty. Next is the digital colonization. We once fought colonization with rifles. Now it's fought with servers. Data flows today are as politically significant as oil routes once were. Who controls data controls citizens. And when your data resides on global cloud servers, your sovereignty becomes a question of bandwidth. In 2020, India proposed the Personal Data Protection Bill. Immediately, there was a global pushback, foreign firms calling it protectionist. But ask yourself, if data of Indian citizens is processed, stored, and monetized abroad, what remains of sovereignty? Ambedkar has once said, quote, political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of its social democracy, unquote. In 21st century, we must add Digital democracy cannot last unless it rests on data sovereignty. Because whoever governs your data governs your destiny. Next to discuss is climate, carbon, and conditionalities. Climate change brought another layer of globalization, moral globalization. Every country is expected to decarbonize, reduce emissions, and align with net zero goals. But here's the hard truth: these targets are not democratically negotiated, they are geopolitically imposed. India is still home to 175 million energy poor citizens. We can't afford to decarbonize at the same speed as Europe or Japan. And yet, when India seeks global space, carbon space, it's labeled as non-cooperative. International climate law has become the new trade regime, filled with commitments, reporting obligations, and carbon pricing. But the cost of compliance is borne by Indian industry, Indian labor, Indian farmers. When Ambedkar said, democracy is a top dressing on undemocratic soil, he didn't foresee that one day even democracy would have to answer to undemocratic globalism. Next is the people's sovereignty in a global age. Here's what's changed most. For the ordinary citizen, the constitution feels distant, while globalization feels immediate. A YouTube algorithm can decide your worldview. A trade policy can make or break your business. A climate target can shut down your factory. A privacy clause can expose your data. This is why the new sovereignty isn't just constitutional, it's experiential. It's about how much control the citizen feels over his own destiny. And that's shrinking. Because democracy is becoming performative, while governance is becoming transnational. Next is the silent transformation of Indian federalism. There is also a domestic echo of this globalization, the centralization of power. When Delhi signs global treaties that bind states, it erodes the federal compact from above: trade, environment, education, all subjects where the union can now invoke international commitments to justify central laws. We saw this tension in GST, NEP, and climate compliance. Federalism, once a constitutional principle, is now treated as an administrative inconvenience. The result: the same logic of globalization, central control, local compliance, repeats within the union itself. Next is the court's last dilemma: who guards the guardian? The Supreme Court stands as the final interpreter, but even it faces an uneasy question: how far can it go in resisting global norms without appearing regressive? When the court invokes UN conventions, it earns applause abroad. When it defends domestic sovereignty, it faces criticism for being nationalist. This moral pressure shapes judgments more than we admit. And yet, constitutional independence means the courage to disagree with global consensus when national context demands it. Otherwise, the judiciary becomes the domestic face of international ideology. Next to discuss is what sovereignty means in the 21st century. So what does sovereignty mean now? It's not isolation, it's negotiated autonomy. It's the right to choose your dependencies consciously, democratically, constitutionally. Our founders gave us a republic, not to shut out the world, but to face it on our terms. The question is, do we still have the discipline, the wisdom, and the courage to do that? Because the Constitution is not just a legal text, it's a statement of authorship, that this nation writes its own story. When we outsource that authorship, even in good faith, we cease to be a republic. Sovereignty is not a slogan, it's a responsibility. To protect, it is not the government's job alone, it's the citizens' discipline. Because a constitution, no matter how sacred, is only as strong as the people who insist on interpreting it for themselves. The next part of this lecture is about the reckoning, reclaiming the constitutional will in a global age. Every generation must answer one question: who truly governs India? In 1947, the answer was simple: the people. In 1950, the answer was constitutional: we the people. But today, in 2025, the answer is blurred: part parliament, part bureaucracy, part algorithm, part boardroom, part foreign directive. That is the fragmentation of sovereignty. And unless we reclaim it consciously, sovereignty will not be stolen. It will simply dissolve. Let's discuss the constitutional sovereignty as an active principle. Sovereignty, as Ambedkar framed it, was not about isolation, it was about authorship. He said, what we must realize is that political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. In today's context, we must add global democracy cannot exist unless each nation retains its power to say no. That power of refusal is the real test of sovereignty. And our constitution gives us three instruments to exercise it. First, parliamentary debate, not just legislation but moral deliberation. Second, judicial interpretation, the balance between openness and autonomy. Third, public awareness, an informed citizenry that understands what's being traded away in the name of global cooperation. But when parliament rubber stamps, courts echo global sentiment, and citizens are kept uninformed, the republic becomes performative. Next is the rebuilding parliamentary control over global commitments. Here is the legal vacuum. India signs over 200 international treaties and MOUs every year. None require parliamentary ratification. No public debate, no committee review. This means a treaty can rewrite entire sectors, trade, data, climate, defense, without elected oversight. Compare that with the US Senate, where every treaty requires a two-thirds vote, or with the UK, where even executive treaties are laid before Parliament for scrutiny. Our founders never imagined such executive absolutism, as Justice Krishna Iyer warned. Foreign policy cannot be the playground of bureaucratic secrecy. It's time for the Treaty Scrutiny Act, mandating parliamentary approval for any international commitment that affects domestic law or citizens' rights. If sovereignty is to mean anything, it must mean accountability in every signature India puts on a global document. Next is judicial realignment, from global citation to constitutional anchoring. The Indian judiciary has grown intellectually global, but emotionally dependent. In Visakhapatnam, Nalsa, Puttaswamy, and Navtej Jauhar, judges invoked international conventions as moral scaffolding. But that practice has consequences. Justice Chelameshwar, in his NJAC dissent, had reminded us, constitutional interpretation must remain within the four corners of constitution. There can be no republic without accountability. We need a judicial philosophy that is not anti-global, but constitutionally rooted. One that says we may agree with global norms, but only when they harmonize with India's social realities and our constitutional text. This isn't isolation, it's intellectual sovereignty. Just as Justice Bhagwati once said in Minerva Mills, limited amending power is itself a basic feature. Similarly, we must say, limited borrowing of global norms is a basic safeguard of sovereignty. Next is economic sovereignty in the age of trade and tech. India's economic sovereignty cannot rely on tariffs anymore. The world is too interconnected, but it can rely on strategic autonomy. Here's what that means in practice. Instead of unrestricted free trade agreements, adopt sovereign compatibility clauses that ensure domestic industries and global rights are protected. International Sovereignty Council, a constitutional advisory body reviewing every major international economic commitment through constitutional filters. Strengthen data localization laws, ensuring all critical personnel and governmental data resides within Indian jurisdiction. Because, make no mistake, in 21st century politics, data is territory, and whoever owns the servers owns the citizens. Ambedkar would have recognized this logic instantly. He once said, quote, "The constitution is not a mere lawyer's document, it is a vehicle of life," unquote. In 2025, that vehicle of life must include our data, our technology, our digital autonomy. Next to discuss is the people's role, from passive subjects to active stakeholders. Every generation must rebuild the idea of citizenship. Today's battle is not fought in trenches or assemblies, it's fought in newsrooms, algorithms, and courtrooms. When your WhatsApp forwards shape your politics, when your apps collect your preferences, and when your vote is influenced by unseen algorithms, the battlefield of sovereignty has shifted into your pocket. That means every citizen must learn to be a constitutionally literate, to ask, who benefits from this global agreement, who decides what India signs, and what part of my freedom is being negotiated in that room, because Ignorance is no longer innocence, it's complicity. Now let's discuss the moral compass, national interest versus global validation. One of the quietest dangers of globalization is moral outsourcing. We begin to believe that global applause equals progress, but often global standards are just political instruments dressed as morality. India must learn to define virtues in its own terms. Sovereignty is not arrogance, it's the courage to set one's own moral compass. Justice R.S. Pathak once said in Bandhua Mukti Morcha, the constitution is a mirror of the national soul. Then the question is, whose soul are we reflecting today? Our own or a global image of what we are expected to be? Now let's discuss the future sovereignty 2.0. In the coming decades, sovereignty won't be a territorial. It will be technological, informational and psychological. Technological sovereignty will depend on how we regulate AI and algorithmic bias. Informational sovereignty will hinge on controlling fake news, propaganda and digital manipulation. Psychological sovereignty will rest on whether citizens can think critically in an era of digital noise. This is the new constitutional battlefield, not about land or law, but mind space. Our challenge is not to retreat from the world, but to engage in with conscious constitutional confidence. India does not need to fear globalization. It needs to negotiate it with self-respect. Now let's have a word on the final reflection. Who writes India's story? In the end, sovereignty is not a line on a map. It is a sentence in story. The story of who writes India's future. Every nation must trade, must cooperate, must engage. But no nation must obey without consent. And consent in a democracy comes not from signatures, but from understanding. If citizens understand the cost of every commitment, if Parliament debates with courage, if the courts interpret with humility, and if the Republic remembers that global cooperation is not global compliance, then we can say with confidence, India remains sovereign. Ambedkar warned us, quote, "We are entering a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality." Unquote. In a time that warning has transformed, in politics, we will have independence, and in global life, we will have dependence. The task before us is not to escape globalization, but to reclaim authorship, so that the Constitution remains the master document, not a footnote in the world's script. I am Amod Bidhuri, and this has been The Next Hearing. If you believe sovereignty must mean something deeper than a slogan, if you believe India's voice must remain its own, then this is your conversation. Because the Constitution isn't just a document to read, it's a will to defend. Until the next hearing, stay informed, stay independent, stay sovereign. Thank you.